Thank you, everybody. Thank you for this super duper introduction, Amir. I love the way he says, I'm going to include this, and this, and I only have 25 minutes. And some of you have heard me speak before, and you'll know that I can speak forever. So this is me trying really hard to be succinct and focused. And I desperately want a Lego version of Clissold House. I'm not going to let him get away with not making one. So, absolutely. When I spoke back in 2017, I was on the fourth of these events, I did a talk called Jewish Hackney. But now, you know, Amir is like really Stoke Newington. He's like one of, you know, he's a Mr. Stoke Newington. So what I've done this evening is put together really Jewish Stokey, as we call it, or Jewish Stoke Newington. So my damage limitation to all of you, because I know you're locals, but Hackney's local. If I don't include an area that you, or a building you think I'm going to include, I apologise in advance. Secondly, the way I walk and talk for a living, and I spend my time looking at buildings and thinking about the stories behind them. What I often think is if you walk past a building, it doesn't always tell the story. You know, you have to dig and delve a little bit. But the other thing I've learned over the years is once you start digging and delving, one story will lead to another story, will lead to another story. It's like a bit like, they say it's, you know, like going down a rabbit hole. So what I've tried to do this evening is to just pinpoint a few elements of Jewish Stoke Newington, and just hope that, you know, some of them will be known to you and maybe some won't. But just as an aside and just to bring you in, Stoke Newington is part of the London Borough of Hackney, and when people think about Jewish London, I think it's fair to say that the image that comes into a typical collective memory is of the Jewish East End, and like late 19th into the 20th century. Nothing wrong in that, that's true. But actually, what was forgotten for many, many decades was the fact that there was a very big Jewish community in Hackney. And Jewish people started coming to Hackney in the 1670s, very soon after Jewish people were allowed back into England. And areas that you know, like Homerton, London Fields, Clapton, they all had Jewish people coming to live there, typically members of the Spanish and Portuguese community. And when the Board of Deputies, Jewish Board of Deputies was founded in 1760, every single Spanish and Portuguese stroke Sephardi member of the Jewish community lived in Hackney. When Ashkenazi, people that came, Jewish people from Northern Europe, started coming to Hackney, some of the most famous families would be, say, the Rothschilds and members of the Montefiore family. They went to Stamford Hill. So you get an idea, people with money. This was aspirational. It was up a hill. The air was clear, you know, and you could look down on London that was getting more and more polluted. And then gradually, as the people came, Russians and Poles came into what was the Jewish East End in the 1880s and beyond, those people who had already been in the Jewish East End for a little bit, they'd managed to make their way, earned a little bit of money, were aspirational, ambitious, they started to move away, and where they moved was due north, straight up the main roads into Hackney, Dalston, Hackney Central, Mare Street, and places like that. So in the late 19th century, you started to get a Jewish community really developing, and you'll see some pictures of that very, very shortly. And then, by the 1930s, there were around 50,000 Jewish people living in Hackney, all of Hackney. And by the 1950s, there were 100,000 Jewish people living in Hackney. And what you've got to bear in mind is at the height of the Jewish East End, there was 125,000 Jewish people. So Hackney was 100,000 Jewish people by the 1950s. As quickly as that community grew, it disappeared. It disappeared almost overnight. Come the 1960s, 1970s, that Jewish community went to the suburbs, typically North London and over to the northeast of London, typically not going to Golders Green. That's where people from the Jewish East End went, so people from Hackney, who always thought, the Jewish people from Hackney always thought they were a little tad above the people from the Jewish East End. That's a different story. And it almost totally disappeared. And because Hackney, I know you all live in Hackney and we love Hackney, Hackney had a difficult reputation, let's put it this way, in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. People that had lived in Hackney never really wanted to talk about it, but it's been the last 30 years or so that the Jewish memories are flooding back and people are really proud of their Jewish Hackney roots. Just as an aside, the Jewish population in England is 0.5%. In London, it's about 1.6%. In Hackney, it's over 6% of the population. So Hackney is a very Jewish area, and I would suggest that the predominant Jewish community in Hackney today would be what some people call the Haredi community or the strictly Orthodox community, the Hasidic community. We have a lot of issues about areas in Hackney. If I mention Homerton, you know where I mean. Clapton, yes. Hackney Central, yes. Mention Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill, that's when we start to get into trouble. So when I meet people and I say, where were you born and brought up? Or where were your mum born and brought up? Dad, they'll go Stoke Newington. I say, where did you live? You know, what street, which synagogue, which school? And they'll tell me. Then I meet somebody else, literally standing over there, and I ask, so this person said they live in Stamford Hill. This person says they lived in Stoke Newington, brought up in Stoke Newington. I go, where did you live? What school did you go to? Which synagogue did you go to? Exactly the same. And there's quite a bit of crossover between this notion of in Jewish Hackney of Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill. So this is my damage limitation. For some of you'll say, well, she's talking about Stamford Hill. Other people are going to say, no, she's talking about Stoke Newington. I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about. But you can see, this is where you get the confusion. Some of you are going to recognise this gentleman. It's Maurice Glassman. When he was ennobled and elevated to the House of Lords, what was the title he chose? Lord Glassman of Stamford Hill and Stoke Newington. Even Maurice Glassman knew that you've got to use two of them together to basically keep everybody happy. That was a 50th birthday present to him, by the way, to become a peer. So I want to talk just a little bit about the synagogues, because I mentioned that it was in the 1880s that this Jewish Hackney really took on. And a lot of the people that were starting the synagogues were coming from the East End, as I said, due north. Some of you will recognise this building. This building opened as the new Dalston Synagogue. It was in Dalston, but it couldn't be called Dalston because Dalston Synagogue was in Poets Road near Newington Green, that area. So they had to call it New Dalston. And it was in Birkbeck Road, first of all. When it came to Shacklewell Lane, it became known as Stoke Newington Synagogue, even though it is clearly in Dalston. So in true Jewish fashion, we called it something totally different, and we just called it Shacklewell Lane Synagogue. But this building dates from 1903, so you get an idea. The money was coming in, the community was proud of itself, and it was building. What happened was the community grew, and then I said rapidly declined. It closed 1976, 1977, and was converted into a Turkish mosque. And this is a rather super photograph from 1985, where you see the dome being built. And what's brilliant about that building is that you can't see the join, as it were. You know, anybody that looks at that building today, the mosque, nobody's going to say, I wonder where that dome came from. But actually, it was a relatively recent addition to it. This is a better picture of it, a more recent photo. Inside, it's interesting because it's been converted to a mosque, but if you do get a chance to go inside, you can see very clearly that it's still a synagogue, and you have to thank the Turkish Muslim community for doing it very sympathetically. But of course, there's always little hints here. This is the foundation stone. You can see it's on the outside. The Honourable Nathaniel Charles Rothschild. He was the son of Natty or Nathaniel Rothschild, who was our first Jewish lord in Britain. But you can also see the treasurer was Gustav Tuck. He was the managing director of Raphael Tuck greetings cards, if anybody remembers them. So you look at that foundation stone, and you've got a number of wonderful, family stories for you to enjoy. This is a synagogue that is still going. This is Finsbury Park Synagogue on Green Lanes. Now, Finsbury Park Synagogue also dates back to the 1880s, started near Finsbury, that's sort of the Finsbury Park side of Green Lanes, was in Princess Street, now Princess Crescent. And in the 1930s, Well, this building's on Green Lanes. This building dates from 1960, and it's had a recent renovation, probably around 2006. And what's interesting here is, this is a going concern, but the sanctuary only holds around 40 or so people, giving an indication of how many people they're expecting to come to a service. But they've got flats above, which brings income in to the synagogue. But in the 1930s, when it wasn't on Green Lanes, it was just beyond, there was a Dayan who came to be the rabbi of the community, Dayan Grunfeld, and he needed work. He was sort of come from Europe. He needed work, and he was shocked by the behaviour of the community, how they talked through the services, and the immodest dress of the women who when they came to weddings. And he said, I couldn't possibly officiate at services like this. And so in the end, they found him a job. He becoming a Dayan, which is a judge in the Jewish Bet Din, the Jewish court of law, and he became, Dayan Grunfeld, very, very much loved. He worked on lots and lots of different Jewish charities. But for those of you that can picture this synagogue, you'll know it's very close to what we call the castle, the climbing castle. And if you're going towards the castle from Clissold Park, Dayan Grunfeld and his wife Judith Grunfeld lived in the last house before the castle. It doesn't exist anymore. We need Amir to sort of do some magic to do a picture of it, but it gives you an idea of the how important. I think what a lot of people forget about Jewish Hackney is how many really important learned people were here in Hackney in the 1930s. We'll come back to the Grunfelds in a minute. This is another going concern synagogue. This is the Adat Yisrael synagogue on Queen Elizabeth's Walk, and this building was built in 1955. You can actually see there the foundation stone there as well. And it mentions Victor Schonfeld. And I think this is one of the glories of Jewish Hackney, that you've got these really important families. They might not be well known outside of the Jewish community, but the Jewish community seriously can't even conceive of their history without them. So Victor Schonfeld also came from Europe. He set up something called the Union of Orthodox Hebrew Congregations in the 1920s, and he was rabbi of this congregation when it was in Burma Road, if anybody knows Burma Road. But he died very young. He died in 1930. He was only 50 years old, and he had a son, Solomon Schonfeld, who basically took over the running of the Hebrew congregation, became rabbi of the synagogue, and also took over the running of the schools that Victor Schonfeld had set up as well. So this building, Victor Schonfeld never would have seen because he'd already died. But the point is, he's mentioned on the foundation stone. Now, he is commemorated, if you know Lordship Road, some of you will know a Victor Mews. It's not far from St Mary's Lodge. Some of you will know buildings better than others. And you've got this lovely Victor Mews. And the reason you've got a Victor Mews is because there were two schools. A Victor is like the Hebrew Yiddish form of Victor, which was his name. There were two Jewish schools that he set up they ultimately ended up on Lordship Road. They had other venues before. There was a primary school and there was a secondary school next door. And you actually in Hackney, in Jewish Hackney, was the site of a strike, a pupil strike in 1955. What happened was Victor's son, Solomon Schonfeld, was running the schools, and he was in charge of something called the Jewish Secondary School Movement, which his father had sort of had set up literally before he died. And what happened was, at the secondary school, there was a headmaster called Mr. Crystal. And Mr. Crystal was Jewish, but he wasn't very orthodox. And Solomon Schonfeld, there's his autograph there, basically wasn't very happy with the Jewish headmaster not being very observant. And he sacked Mr. Crystal. But the children, the students, loved him. And so what do you do if your favourite headmaster is sacked? You go on strike. And in 1955, the Jewish students of the Victor Senior School went on strike until Mr. Crystal was reinstated. How about, bless you, how about that for a little bit of pupil, not people power, but pupil power. In the event, it was all a very sad state State of Affairs, and that school, for lots of reasons, was shut down in 1961. The primary school continued actually until 2005, and on the site of the school is now a big Jewish sort of educational centre. As you walk through to Lordship Road from Queen Elizabeth Walk, you'll walk past the centre that's on it. Now, I mentioned Diane Grunfeld before, the highly principled Diane Grunfeld, and much loved Diane Grunfeld. His wife was Dr. Judith Grunfeld, and you see her autograph here on these very important certificates. And she was headmistress, and she was much, much loved. And if you go, one of the glories of matching up stories is you go all over the country, you go all over the world, and your stories match up. So you go to Shefford, and you find where the Evictor schools were evacuated during the Second World War. This is a dreadful photograph, but it's one I took 100 years ago with a very old phone camera. But here it is, there's the school, and when they're evacuated. And here is Dr. Judith Grunfeld, much loved. She was known as Hamulka, the Queen, and she had a lot of vitality. Her husband wasn't well, he died relatively young, and she travelled the world speaking. She was a great pioneer of education for girls, and she actually sold out Madison Square Garden talking, so that's pretty impressive. Also, very importantly, in Jewish Hackney in Stoke Newington was the Bisted Memorial Hospital. So the Bisted Memorial Hospital had its antecedent in the Jewish East End as the Jewish Maternity Hospital, opened in 1912, extended in 1928. The Bearsteds, if you don't know the Bearsted name, you might have heard of Marcus Samuel, and if you haven't heard of Marcus Samuel, you've probably heard of Shell Transport and Trading, which merged with Royal Dutch to form Royal Dutch Shell in 1907, and Marcus Samuel, the first Lord Bearsted, basically invented the oil tanker, and he put a lot of money back into the Jewish community. So it became known as the Bearsted Memorial Hospital. And as the community was leaving the East End and going into, particularly into Hackney, they decided to move the maternity hospital to Hackney. And in 1947, after a stop during the war in Hampton Court, it moved to Stoke Newington, some people say Stamford Hill, on Lordship Road. And here it is. It lasted until 1974, opened in 1947, closed in 1974, by stealth actually, but that's another story. And the whole site has been redeveloped. You've got a small centre with lots of facilities for the Jewish community, including for children with special needs, etc. But very importantly, on Lordship Road, on the site of the Bisted Memorial Hospital, you've got Schonfelds Square. Now, some people say that Schonfelds Square is named after Victor Schonfeld. I say it's named after his son, Solomon Schonfeld. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One, I want to mention Solomon Schonfeld. Two, when you go inside one of the buildings, there is a massive photograph of lots and lots of children who absolutely owe their new lives in England to Solomon Schonfeld. So, as I said, he was 18 when his father died. He had to become the rabbi of the community. He had to operate the schools. I mean, he really took on a lot as a young man, a lot of responsibility. He married Judith Hertz, who happened to be the daughter of the chief rabbi at the time. And then, of course, in the 1930s, there was a lot of issue about getting people out of Nazi Europe. And then we had the Second World War. There's lots and lots of organisations who did brilliant work bringing people out before the war and after the war. A lot of them were people from the middle classes. They were urban. They had business associates. They could deal with paperwork. The group of people who found it most difficult to leave Nazi Europe, both in the 30s and afterwards, were those who were Orthodox. They just didn't have the money, the wherewithal. Solomon Schonfeld did masses of work to get members of the Orthodox community out, people that needed to worship regularly, people that needed kosher food, people who were moles, people that did the circumcisions, people who were sophers, people that did the scribing, the writing of the parchments. Those were the people that needed the help, and that's what he did. And you see he's in a uniform. It's all made up. He basically made up the chief rabbi's refugee emergency committee, and he just made a uniform, he made a cap, he made passports, he made paperwork, and just let anybody refuse him anything, he wasn't going to have it. So basically really important. This Schonfelds Square is state-of-the-art housing. People come from all over the world to see how you can integrate multi-generational demographics within one housing estate, but not only multi-generational demographics, there's people with special needs, there's mother and babies homes, there's homes for survivors, from the Holocaust. Sadly, most of them are dying or very, very infirm. If you're interested in social housing, this is the place to come and visit, and it's on your doorstep. Talking about care, if you go up Green Lanes towards Manor House Station, you'll see Wolfson House, and you'll see it's part of the NHS. Nobody gives the matter any thought at all. But when this was opened as Wolfson House, I think in the 70s, it was actually a care home run by Jewish Care, which is a very important Jewish charity. And what's interesting here, it was funded in part by the Wolfson family. If anybody knows Burberry, great Universal stores from yesteryear, the Wolfsons have a foundation, and it's very, very philanthropic on medicine, theatre, science, colleges, everything. So they help fund this. Of course, by the 2000s, people didn't want their parents living in a care home in Hackney. They wanted them all to be in Stanmore and Boreham Wood. And so nobody had vision. And so in 2007, the care home closed. It's now used by the NHS, but the name has stayed. So you've got that link to the past there as well. That's Isaac Wolfson, sorry, the gentleman who set up the foundation. And then, got to talk about food very briefly. The egg stores, that is probably one of the most famous shops, Jewish shops in Hackney. Opened in 1948. I remember it in the early 1980s when I lived in South Tottenham. And it was taken over in 1969 by the Friedlander family. And it just hasn't changed, that's its glory. And Amir doesn't have to do a time scan of it because it just looks exactly the same, decade after decade after decade. But classic, if you're interested in typography and retail design, that egg stores. I don't know if it's listed, but if it's not, it absolutely should. So if you want to go there, do. And then, of course, there were factories. Jewish people came to Stoke Newington and set up factories. This is a great photograph of the Politi chimney. Some of you, this was taken from the overground. Some of you will know it at the top of Manor Road near Stoke Newington Station, so I can include it. It's near Stoke Newington Station. And Politi, it was David Politi. He was born in Corfu, came over to England in 1862 as a 17-year-old, went to Manchester, opened up a sweet factory, came to London to get married at Bearsteds Synagogue, went back to Manchester, came down to London to continue making sweets. He had a factory just off Green Lanes. Then in 1911, you can see it in the Star of David, he opened the factory here. And I think what's glorious here is that he felt very safe and secure here. He put a Star of David on the outside of his factory. He predominantly made Turkish delight, and it was, you can see with the rose, the mint, and the almond. And I'm a very proud owner of an old Politi, and I was in Corfu earlier this year, and in Corfu town, there is a Politi street. So there's Politi Street, and my Hackney Politi tin. So there you go. I know, I'm a little bit nerdy, what can you do? And talking about where did people live, well, you've seen lots of the kinds of streets and the houses where people lived with Amir's pictures. This is Coronation and Imperial Avenues. They were built in 1903 with shops at the ground level, and those shops are still there. We don't need to go into time travel. Some things don't change. And what you have here are the gates. They're administered by an organisation called the IDS, which is the descendant of the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company, which was founded by the Rothschilds. So you get these same kind of stories all intermingling to make affordable housing for people, Jewish and non-Jewish. All the Jewish charities, by the way, always had provision for non-Jewish people. So if you were a non-Jewish lady having a baby and you wanted to go to the Jewish maternity hospital, the Bearsted, you'd never be turned away. Likewise, you wouldn't be turned away if you needed somewhere to live in these properties. And of course, for those of you who live in the area, you'll know that on the 13th of October 1940, there was a terrible, terrible tragedy during the Second World War where people were sheltering underneath these blocks of flats, and over 160 people were killed on that evening. And there's a plaque that's been put up commemorating them. There's a beautiful book, I don't know if anybody knows it, called Just Like the End of the World. I don't know if anybody's read it, and it's got lots of oral testimonies in it by adults remembering what it was like. And, if you read them, and particularly if you read them out loud, they are so moving about the loss of family. But of course, there were Jewish and non-Jewish people who were sheltering and were killed. And one of the things they mention when they talk about the oral histories is that there wasn't time really to work out who everybody was, who was Jewish, who wasn't Jewish. And in fact, some Jewish people were buried at Abney Park rather than a Jewish cemetery. Some non-Jewish people were buried in a Jewish cemetery. And so this memorial that you have at Abney Park Cemetery is really, really important. And you can see the names of the people from Coronation, Imperial Avenues who died, and you can spot some of the names are Jewish. Obviously, many of them are not. A really tragic event. The IDS, the Industrial Dwelling Society that administers Imperial and Coronation Avenues, also administers Nathaniel Court, right near Manor House Tube. And Nathaniel Court, named after Nathaniel Rothschild, the first Jewish lord that I mentioned, the person who founded the 4% Industrial Dwellings Company that became the IDS. And again, mostly for Jewish people, but not entirely so. These flats never come on the market. They were actually built in the late 60s for members of the Jewish community who were disabled, maybe disabled and blind, but disabled. So the flats are very spacious because they were built to allow for wheelchairs and walkers and things like that. So when people have a really spacious flat, they don't want to let it go. But it is under threat. You've got to be careful because the Woodbury Down estate, is growing behind it. So people are being very vigilant about that site. And talking about the Woodbury Down estate, again, a well-told story. It's been told in Amir's Stoke Newington history evenings. Built post-Second World War, totally finished ultimately by 1962. It's not the story that I'm going to tell, but it gives you an idea of the extent. Because I want, as part of that Woodbury Down estate, was the Woodbury Down Health Centre, which in 1965 was renamed the John Scott Health Centre, which it is today. But I want to mention this because in October 1952, the first baby was weighed there, and I never know who's going to be in my groups when I do a walking tour. And one of the ladies on my walking tour a couple of years ago lived in a house just up the road from the health centre, and she said, "Rachel, here I am. Evelyn Rose was her maiden name. I was the first baby that was weighed here." She got a photograph of her. And I'm just going to read to you. Oh, sorry, I think that might be the mic. I'm just going to read to you what was published in the newspaper. Evelyn Grossman, chubby, curly-haired infant daughter of a North London mother, has just had the finest medical checkup any child anywhere in the world could have. And 35-year-old Parisian-born, they lived in a house called Parisette, actually, on Green Lane. And 35-year-old Parisian-born Mrs. Rachel Grossman is full of praise for the team of doctors, nurses, nutrition and dietary experts who pronounced her child a normal, healthy specimen of English babyhood. Evelyn, who resembles the Queen's little daughter, Princess Anne, has the distinction of being the first baby examined in London's new-style, all-in health centre that will relieve thousands of London mothers of anxiety for the health and well-being of their little ones. So there you have it. You never know what you're going to find out. But I'm going to end where I began, with confusion. Do you live in Stoke Newington or do you live in Stamford Hill? You know what? Nobody knows. So this is honey that was made in a street called St Kilda's Road, if anybody knows St Kilda's Road. and a lovely chap. He now lives in Edgware, called Joseph Schneck. He was a very, very Orthodox gentleman. And in his garden, he had hives for bees and goats and rabbits and chickens and goodness knows what else. It was a farm. It was a farm. But he started making honey at 26 St Kilda's Road. And I just love the idea that one day it's Stamford Hill honey, another day it's Stoke Newington honey. And with that, everybody, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming. Thank you, I'm here.